At 2:45 on the sweltering afternoon of August 12, 1944, Private Shaky Lou Miller stood upright in a muddy French ditch, eyes squeezed shut, holding a submachine gun over his head in a display of pure, unadulterated panic. Unlike the calculated marksman of the Montana mountains, the 19-year-old from the Bronx had never seen a tree larger than a fire hydrant and possessed a confirmed kill count of 0, despite having wasted 4,000 rounds of ammunition in a single week of combat. While 300 German soldiers sat in plain sight, casually eating lunch just 20 yards away, Lou began his method, a frantic, noisy technique that involved no aiming, no breathing control, and absolutely no sightings. The 300 Germans didn't scatter or dive for cover. Instead, they simply looked up, watched the bullets fly 20 feet over their heads into the afternoon clouds, and went back to their sausages, realizing that Lou Miller was the least dangerous man in Western Europe. Lou's sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Iron Mike, had once asked if Lou had ever actually looked through the sights of his weapon, to which Lou replied that the metal pins were too small and blocked his view of the scenery. While legendary snipers relied on 15 years of elk hunting and wind reading, Lou relied on 15 years of dodging taxis and throwing snowballs at pigeons, operating under the philosophy that if he didn't know where the bullet was going, the enemy definitely wouldn't either. By 3:00 p.m., the Germans were starting to feel a strange sense of pity for the 40 Americans surrounding them, a unit that had seemingly attended the same shout-and-shoot school of infantry. They were at point-blank range, close enough to see the polish on the Germans' boots, yet for 6 hours, the Americans unleashed a wall of lead that resulted in a statistical miracle. 23 trees were chopped down, 2 low-flying birds were accidentally grounded, and 1 German mess tin was slightly dented, but not a single enemy soldier was scratched. This wasn't long-range precision. It was the great point-blank panic, a tactical failure of such magnitude that it defied the laws of probability. When Lou's captain demanded to know why he wasn't aiming, Lou explained he was using psychological perforation, the hope that if they made enough noise, the enemy would eventually get a headache and go home. By 8:00 p.m., the 300 Germans finally stood up, not because they were defeated by the hail of lead, but because they were bored by the lack of accuracy. They simply gathered their gear and walked away, leaving the 40 Americans standing in a pile of 10,000 empty brass casings, having accomplished absolutely nothing. Lou Miller returned to the Bronx in 1945 without a Silver Star, instead receiving a bill from the Department of Defense for excessive lead consumption, leaving behind a legacy that military historians still study as the ultimate example of how 300 men can comfortably ignore a single rifleman. What made the situation even more remarkable was the calm reaction of the German soldiers who, after the first few minutes of wildly inaccurate gunfire, realized that they were in no real danger at all. Some reportedly leaned back against their packs and watched the American barrage the way spectators might watch fireworks on a summer evening. Every few minutes another burst of bullets would whistle overhead, clipping leaves off trees or punching harmless holes into the distant hedgerows, but none came anywhere near the men sitting on the grass. One soldier supposedly raised his canteen in Lou's direction, as if offering a silent toast to the most enthusiastic but least accurate shooter he had ever encountered. In a war defined by brutal efficiency and deadly precision, the absurdity of the moment briefly replaced fear with confusion. Back in the American ditch, however, the atmosphere was very different. Lou's fellow soldiers were desperately trying to look busy, firing short bursts in random directions while glancing nervously at their sergeant, hoping no one would ask them to actually advance. The heat, the noise, and the constant cloud of gun smoke created the illusion of a fierce battle, even though the only casualties so far were local tree branches and an unfortunate crow that had flown across the wrong stretch of sky. Private Miller, convinced that volume was more important than accuracy, continued firing with the enthusiasm of a man trying to empty the entire ammunition supply of the United States Army before sunset. Each new magazine was slammed into his weapon with heroic determination, followed by another roaring burst aimed vaguely at the horizon. Sergeant Iron Mike, who had survived 2 campaigns and could recognize a hopeless situation faster than anyone else in the platoon, finally lowered his binoculars and shook his head slowly. In his long military career, he had witnessed artillery barrages, tank assaults, and carefully planned ambushes, but he had never before seen a firefight where both sides could comfortably eat lunch in the middle of it. Watching Lou blaze away like a malfunctioning firework launcher, the veteran muttered that if enthusiasm alone won wars, the conflict in Europe would have been over before dinner. Instead, the strange standoff dragged on under the hot French sun, with thousands of rounds of ammunition flying harmlessly into the sky, while the war's least effective battle quietly wrote its place in the most ridiculous corner of military legend. Lou Miller returned to the Bronx in 1945 without a Silver Star, instead receiving a bill from the Department of Defense for excessive lead consumption, leaving behind a legacy that military historians still study as the ultimate example of how 300 men can comfortably ignore a single rifleman. Yet the strange story of that afternoon did not end when the Germans casually walked away from the field. As the smoke drifted away and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the countryside, the American platoon slowly realized that they had just experienced one of the most bizarre non-battles of the entire war. Empty shell casings covered the dirt like a field of brass snow, crunching under the soldiers' boots as they stood there in stunned silence. No one quite knew what to say. They had fired thousands upon thousands of rounds, shouted commands, ducked behind trees, and acted like they were in the middle of a desperate firefight. Yet the enemy had simply stood up and left out of pure boredom. Sergeant Iron Mike walked over to Lou, who was still clutching his submachine gun with the proud exhaustion of a man who believed he had just fought heroically. The veteran slowly looked at the smoking weapon, then at the massive pile of empty magazines scattered around Lou's feet. Finally, with the patience of a man who had seen too much war to be surprised by anything, he asked the question that had been bothering him for hours. "Kid, did you hit anything?" Lou scratched his helmet, looked out across the quiet field, and shrugged. According to Lou's personal theory of warfare, the mission had been a success simply because the Germans had eventually gone away. In his mind, it didn't matter whether they left because they were defeated or because they were tired of watching him miss. The rest of the platoon wasn't so sure. One soldier climbed out of the ditch and walked carefully across the open ground, expecting at any moment to discover fallen enemies hidden in the tall grass. Instead, he found nothing but abandoned footprints, empty sausage wrappers, and the faint smell of lunch drifting through the warm air. The Germans had truly left without suffering a single casualty. It was the kind of result that made officers write extremely creative reports later that evening, carefully choosing words that made the encounter sound slightly more respectable than it actually was. When the company captain eventually heard about the incident, he tried to reconstruct what had happened during those 6 hours of enthusiastic but ineffective combat. The numbers alone were astonishing. Rough estimates suggested that the platoon had fired nearly 10,000 rounds of ammunition. In return, the confirmed damage included a handful of shredded bushes, several wounded tree trunks, 2 unlucky birds, and 1 dented German mess tin that may or may not have been hit by accident. Even in a war famous for chaos, the ratio of bullets fired to results achieved was almost unbelievable. Lou, however, remained completely confident in his unusual combat philosophy. To him, the event proved that aggressive noise and overwhelming enthusiasm could frighten the enemy into retreat. He proudly explained to anyone willing to listen that warfare was as much about psychology as it was about accuracy. If the enemy believed they were under attack by someone reckless enough to fire endlessly without aiming, then perhaps they would eventually decide it wasn't worth staying around. In Lou's mind, the Germans walking away from the field was proof that his strategy had worked perfectly. Military historians who later heard versions of the story had mixed reactions. Some dismissed it as a humorous exaggeration passed around by soldiers after the war. Others saw it as a strange but believable moment that captured the unpredictable nature of combat during the massive campaigns of World War II. After all, wars are usually remembered for their epic battles, brilliant strategies, and heroic victories, but scattered among those dramatic moments are countless smaller stories, confusing encounters, accidental standoffs, and situations so absurd that they seem almost impossible. In the end, Private Lou Miller's legendary afternoon became less about marksmanship and more about the strange human side of war. Not every soldier was a trained sniper or a fearless hero charging into battle with perfect aim. Many were ordinary young men thrown into terrifying situations they barely understood, trying to survive with whatever instincts they had. Lou's instinct simply happened to be pulling the trigger as fast as possible and hoping something good would happen eventually. And somewhere in the quiet fields of France, long after the war ended and the forests grew back around the bullet-scarred trees, the memory of that strange encounter remained. A moment when hundreds of soldiers faced each other across 20 yards of open ground. Thousands of bullets filled the sky, and yet not a single man was harmed. In a war filled with tragedy, destruction, and unimaginable sacrifice, the story of the Great Point-Blank Panic survived as a rare, almost unbelievable reminder that sometimes the most memorable moments of history are also the most ridiculous. Lou's story, strange as it sounded, slowly spread through nearby units over the following weeks. Soldiers passing through the sector would hear fragments of the tale from different mouths, each version becoming slightly more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed Lou had fired so many rounds that his weapon glowed red in the afternoon sun. Others insisted the Germans had actually applauded before leaving, impressed by the sheer volume of noise produced by a single nervous rifleman. Like many wartime stories, the truth blurred together with humor, turning a confusing battlefield moment into a legend that soldiers repeated whenever the tension of combat needed to be broken. Within the platoon itself, the event became a running joke. Whenever ammunition was distributed before a patrol, someone would inevitably glance at Lou and say, "Easy there, Miller. We only have enough for one forest today." Another soldier once asked if Lou planned to bring down an entire mountain range the next time they encountered the enemy. Lou, unfazed by the teasing, simply grinned and insisted that the Germans had retreated because they feared his advanced firing doctrine. In the grim atmosphere of war, where fear and exhaustion constantly weighed on the men, moments like this offered a rare opportunity to laugh. Sergeant Iron Mike, despite his gruff reputation, eventually began telling the story himself when new replacements joined the unit. During briefings, he would sometimes gesture toward Lou and explain that accuracy mattered just as much as courage. "You can have all the bullets in the world," he would say, "but if you do know where they're going, you're just trimming the countryside." The lesson was clear, but the tone was lighthearted enough that even Lou couldn't help smiling as the recruits glanced at him with a mix of disbelief and amusement. The officers, meanwhile, quietly filed the incident away as an example of the chaos that could erupt when inexperienced troops faced sudden combat. Training manuals emphasized discipline, controlled fire, and clear command structures, but the reality of battle often shattered those neat theories within seconds. When fear took hold, even simple actions, like aiming a weapon, could become surprisingly difficult. Lou's frantic firing, ridiculous as it appeared afterward, was a raw demonstration of how overwhelming a battlefield could feel to someone who had never experienced it before. Interestingly, the abandoned German lunch site later became something of a curiosity among the Americans stationed nearby. A few days after the encounter, several soldiers revisited the spot and found scattered evidence of the bizarre standoff. Empty ration tins, footprints in the soft soil, and the faint marks of bullets embedded high in tree trunks painted a clear picture of what had happened. The Germans had indeed sat calmly within sight of the Americans, while the storm of inaccurate gunfire passed harmlessly overhead. It was a moment that perfectly illustrated the strange mixture of tension and absurdity that sometimes defined life on the front lines. For Lou, however, the experience had a subtle effect. Although he never fully abandoned his chaotic firing style, the teasing and lectures from his squad slowly pushed him to improve. Over the following months, he began practicing with the weapon's sights more seriously, learning the basics of controlled bursts and careful aiming. By the end of the campaign, he had at least developed the ability to hit targets that were not classified as trees, clouds, or unlucky wildlife. The transformation wasn't dramatic enough to make him a legendary marksman, but it was enough that his fellow soldiers no longer felt the need to duck whenever he pulled the trigger. Still, the legend of that first encounter never faded. Even as the war moved deeper into Europe and the battles grew more intense, someone in the platoon would occasionally bring up the afternoon when 300 German soldiers calmly finished lunch, while one American soldier attempted to frighten them away through pure volume of fire. In a conflict remembered for its massive armies and brutal engagements, the strange standoff remained a small but unforgettable story, a reminder that history is not only shaped by great generals and decisive battles, but also by ordinary individuals whose unexpected actions create moments that no strategy could ever predict. And so the tale of Lou Miller continued to circulate among soldiers long after the guns of that particular afternoon fell silent. Somewhere between embarrassment and pride, between comedy and chaos, it captured a tiny slice of the unpredictable human experience inside the enormous machinery of war. The battlefield might have been filled with tactics, orders, and carefully planned operations, but every so often it also produced a moment like this, where thousands of bullets filled the air, dozens of witnesses stood stunned in muddy trenches, and the enemy simply stood up, brushed off their uniforms, and walked away from the strangest firefight they had ever seen.